All right, so today we're going to talk about what happens, how you actually use an enzyme in a reactor. So I gave you the sort of concept of what would happen if you had a reactor with an enzyme in it, and how could you do some of your basic balances last class. But in that case, I didn't tell you anything about how the enzyme would actually manage to stay in the reactor. I just told you there was an imaginary semi-permeable membrane that just happened to exclude the enzyme and happened to allow the substrate and product to go back out. That's incredibly difficult to do in practice. So how would you imagine that you could keep an enzyme in a continuous bioreactor if you wanted to? What are ways you can stop the enzyme from leaving the bioreactor? So Cece just said one of the big methods that people do, which is could you attach it to something? So absolutely, a lot of people do just that. They attach it to things, and they attach it to different kinds of things. So what people do is they immobilize the enzyme on a surface. So that's called bound. So something where it's somehow attached to a surface. There are a bunch of ways you can do that. We'll talk about some of those. Beyond binding it to a surface, can you think of any other ways that you could potentially keep an enzyme in a reactor? So this is a solid surface.
Put a filter on the out so it can't go through.
Kind of. So you're on the right track.
Do you have like two different densities that only see one base sort of?
Then it wouldn't interact with each other.
So kind of. So any other thoughts?
If you had like a membrane separating half the reactor with the enzyme lines and then half for like a substrate, wasn't the substrate could go in and out of the membrane, but not the
The enzyme can't leave it. Yeah.
What about just filtering your outstream and recycling the enzyme back in?
So that is possible, but quite difficult. Separating out enzymes is a challenging task. So we'll actually go through a case where we do recycle a lot of stuff back in when we start talking about the cells. So the cells you can recycle back in because it's pretty easy to separate cells out, but enzymes are actually, it turns out, quite difficult to separate out. So it's a neat idea in a very particular right circumstance, you might be able to do it. But Carl's idea is sort of along the right track. Now you could see if you just had one filter in the membrane that prevented the enzyme from leaving and the substrate had to diffuse through and then react and then stuff diffused out, you'd have some pretty substantial limitations in terms of kinetics, right? Like it would take a long time for the substrate to diffuse all the way over to the other side of the reactor and diffuse all the way back out. But you can do, so the alternative is called entrapped. You can do things where you have them encapsulated in a membrane, so just like you said, but in a much smaller geometry.
oh, like stairs.
So those are called, it's called microencapsulation. So they're little spheres. Similarly, you can do things where it's sort of entrapped. I mean, the whole thing, I called it entrapped. But here you can think of this more as like in a hydrogel or something like that. So the enzyme is entrapped within the hydrogel and the substrate can diffuse in, react with the enzyme, and diffuse back out. Again, these ones are depending on the enzyme being much bigger than the substrate of the product. And then similarly, I said that was spheres. You can do the same thing similarly avoiding the diffusion limitations by having it in a planar organization. So rather than just one membrane over half of the reactor, you could have membranes in a flat planar way that allow substrate and product to diffuse in from either side. So you have relatively small diffusion limitations as a result of that. And you can set it up sort of with lots and lots of these sheets of membranes. So that's actually how some of they're cell-based, but how some of the water treatment plants now work. They have this sort of flat planar membrane set up where there's lots and lots and lots of them. There are issues with all of these methods. So first of all, I'm going to talk, just because I like it, I'm going to talk a little bit about stuff that you'll learn about in 4T3, because it's got the same basic principles or concepts in it. So binding the enzyme to a substrate, to a solid backing, how do you think you could do that? What are different ways?
Do you use antibodies for things?
So you could use antibodies, but antibodies are incredibly expensive. So even the enzyme is expensive, the antibodies are going to be 10 times as expensive as the enzyme. So conceptually it works. In practice, it's really expensive.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about just chemical bonds then?
So just like covalent bonds.
Or like adding like sulfur or something, adding a disulfide group.
So absolutely, some people do covalent binding between a substrate and a surface. This is actually a method that's used quite often in biomaterials, because if you want to implant something in the body, usually the surface itself ends up being a bad contact surface for a bunch of reasons. It causes blood clotting and inflammation and all kinds of other things. So people try and bind things to the surface either to cause cells to bind to it or have other interactions with the body. And they actually will covalently bind the proteins to the surface or peptides to the surface. What might be some problems with doing that?
You have to be able to, like, you have to have functional groups that are available in the body.
So typically covalent bonds like this, it's very difficult to say I'm only binding it to one side of the enzyme. So randomly you can get different sides of the enzyme showing. So there might be a reactive group here, but there might be another one there and another one there. So they can be difficult to access. And depending on what covalent binding conditions you're using, if you're using quite not one of the more elegant ones that's used in biomaterials, but you're using sort of a quick and easy and inexpensive method, then those also can end up denaturing your enzymes. So not only is the binding site not available, but the whole enzyme might end up having all kinds of different places bound that makes them not functional. Again, there are much more elegant ways of binding it, but then they get much more expensive. Another thing to consider when you're doing this is it's a one-time thing. So if the conditions that your enzymes are in are not ideal, then what happens is over time, these enzymes can become denatured, and there's no real way of regenerating a surface that has covalently bound stuff to it. So you just have to basically take it out, because now your activity of your surfaces has gone down to the extent that it's not useful anymore, and replace it with a new one, which again is quite expensive. And as I mentioned, it's just generally more expensive to covalently bind things. So another way that people do it is most plastics actually have a really high affinity for proteins. So proteins really like sticking to plastic, generally. And so even if you just incubate the surface with your enzyme, you get adsorption. So a lot of your enzymes will just stick to the surface of your polymer, which is awesome. in that context, in a biomaterials context, maybe not so awesome. And many people think that that's actually one of the big problems with biomaterials is that they, as soon as you put them in the context of your body, all of your body's proteins start sticking to it, and not always sticking to it in the orientation that you want it. Sometimes they're denatured, and sometimes some of those proteins are activated. So you get opsonins like immunoglobulin G stuck to it, so macrophages come along and say, hey, there's something wrong. And you can get all kinds of other proteins that your body then responds to, even though they may not be able to see the polymer, but they're seeing the protein stuck to it. Yeah.
Why do they stick to plastic? Do they electrostatic forces or?
So there's van der Waals forces, there's electrostatic forces, there's hydrogen bonding. So there's all kinds of different reasons that proteins stick to polymer surfaces. And I would say it's not fully understood. There have been, so about 30 years ago was the heyday of trying to understand proteins bound to surfaces, and actually one of the profs in our department was one of the pioneers of these studies, so Dr. Brash, who's emeritus now but still actively doing research. He actually was one of the pioneers to understand how and why proteins bind to polymer surfaces. So there were a ton of studies where they tried to change surface charge, they tried to change hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity, they tried to change different properties of the polymers, and still, for the most part, proteins would stick to the surfaces. You could get some that had a little bit more and some that had a little bit less. They found that very hydrophobic surfaces tended to cause the proteins to change conformation, as you might expect, because the hydrophobic core would rearrange and then stick to the hydrophobic surface. So that was potentially bad. Another side note about that is there was a hypothesis for a while that silicone breast implants were causing your own body's proteins to stick to them, rearrange in such a way that your immune system reacted and caused your immune system to become autoimmune and cause all these like side autoimmune problems. So that was the basis of the huge lawsuit that against, I think it was Dow Corning, that was millions and billions of dollars, and then subsequently all of the cohort studies that followed women who had breast implants and didn't show that there was no increase in autoimmune disorders among women who had breast implants compared to those who didn't. So there's no actual evidence that that happens, but it's an important historical note. The other thing that can happen with adsorption, because it's this range of van der Waals forces and hydrogen bonds, and it's not nearly as strong bond as covalent, is that you can get rearrangement and loss. So over time you can lose so it's super cheap to do. Basically you dip your surfaces in a protein solution, let them stay there for 5 minutes, and then they're coated with your enzyme. Ta-da, awesome. And relatively easy to regenerate. Go clean it off and dip it again. If you have anything like any kind of soap solution, so any kind of SDS or anything like that in your mix, that'll take off your enzymes. So you have to be careful about your conditions. But you can also find if your conditions have any other proteins there, over time, if those proteins actually have a slightly higher affinity for the surface than the enzymes, they can end up replacing those proteins. So that actually happens in biomaterials as well. If you look at the profile of proteins that are initially on a surface, it doesn't necessarily reflect the profile of the proteins that are on the surface quite a while later, because you can't have, although it's it appears to be a permanent reaction. In fact, there can be a little bit of rearrangement of which proteins end up on the surface. So this has the potential to still lose some enzymes. And then people also, of course, can do, say, electrostatic interactions So they can make a charged surface intentionally if they know that their enzyme is negatively charged. You can have electrostatic interactions. Again, depending on conditions, that's very easy to disrupt. And you can have the enzyme replaced. If you have other negative things in your system, they can easily come in and replace the enzyme, and you lose the enzyme on your surface. So there are some downsides of the immobilized bound approach, but also some upsides. Oh, the other thing that people do actually, sometimes they'll adsorb and then cross-link the enzymes. So you can, there are a bunch of cross-linkers that are available that people try and basically then stabilize that surface by cross-linking it. The problem with that typically is that you lose a lot of enzyme activity in trying to do that, because the cross-linkers are not cross-linking specific sites. They can actually end up cross-linking the active site and changing the conformation of your enzymes. So although that's much more, if you cross-link it, it's much more stable, and you're not going to have the loss and replacement nearly at the same rate, you're losing a bunch of activity right up front.
Why is the loss or replacement bad? You're replacing the same thing. Here.
Well, if you're replacing with the same thing, that's no problem. But if you're sitting it in a reactor where the only source of the enzyme is on your surface, and then you've got stuff coming in that's substrate and product, it might get replaced with substrate or product or other contaminants. So over time, you just end up depleting your enzyme and depleting your enzyme. So yes, you could take it out, you could put it back in an enzyme mixture, sit it for a while, regenerate it basically, and then stick it back in your reactor, and that's good. But over time, just sitting in the reactor, it has the potential to lose activity. That's the downside of it being replaceable. Any other questions about the bound approach of putting enzymes on a surface? Okay, so the next approach is the entrapped approach. So anyone who worked in Dr. Hoare's lab has seen entrapped approaches where they're using microgels for drug delivery and entrapping the drugs. Depending on how you design that entrapment method, it may not last for very long, so they can leach out of your entrapped gels. But it all depends on how you're doing the entrapment. What can you envision, even if it's perfectly entrapped? I kind of hinted at it before, but what can you envision as one issue with the entrapped approach? Right, so basically it slows down how fast the substrate can get into the enzyme, and then the product can get back out. So we're actually going to deal with the math of that in the next couple of classes, how that happens. Yeah. So side note, just because I have to. So a lot of enzymes often are microencapsulated. One reason that people will do that is not just to keep them so that you can basically have a large filter that keeps the large entrapped microcapsules from leaving the reactor. But people also microencapsulate enzymes because it stabilizes them. So say they're in quite a harsh environment, if the outside of it breaks down over time and then releases the enzyme when it's not as harsh an environment, that's quite popular. So actually you see that method happen with laundry detergents. So often there are these little specks. They're encapsulated, basically gel encapsulated enzymes, and once they're in the washing solution, like the water basically washes away so in that case they're not expecting the substrate to diffuse in, they're expecting the microcapsule outside to go away. But it's not uncommon to see microencapsulated enzymes in a lot of different industrial circumstances that aren't just bioreactors. But I have to talk about microencapsulation because I spent 5 years of my life dealing with microcapsules. And in that case, I actually was dealing with microencapsulated cells. So just to do a side note, so one of the first tissue engineering sort of approaches was microencapsulation. And the idea was that you took an islet, and for diabetics, so if you have type 1 diabetes, the problem is you have an autoimmune disorder where you generate antibodies against your own islets that causes the cells in them, within the beta islets, it causes those cells to die, and therefore you have no more insulin production capabilities. So even if you were to give a whole new pancreas to a diabetic who's type 1 diabetic, in 2 years your immune system would have reacted to it and killed off all of the islets again, and you'd be diabetic again. Actually, you do see people getting those transplants, but typically only when other organs have failed if they're diabetics. So diabetes can cause your kidneys to fail and your liver to fail and have other organ failures because you've had uncontrolled glucose. So in those cases where diabetics need other organs, then they'll replace the pancreas and put them on immune suppression medication, which is your anti-rejection medication. And then they won't have the autoimmune response to their own pancreas, and they lose the diabetes. But anti-rejection medication has a lot of nasty side effects, so you don't want to do that. Like the side effects of the anti-rejection medication are worse than the side effects of diabetes. So people typically wouldn't just transplant a pancreas and give the anti-rejection medication. So, but when you do your poke test for your glucose in your blood and give yourself insulin injections, you've got big spikes and drops, and it's not a very well controlled blood glucose. So the idea was that you could transplant islets in, and the islets would be responsive to the glucose in the blood, and they would produce insulin. But you'd have this semi-permeable membrane that would prevent antibodies, T cells, etc., from getting in and killing off the islet. So the islets would be protected from the immune system by the semi-permeable membrane, but you'd still allow the substrate to get in and basically the product to get out while retaining your islet, which is sort of like your enzyme.
Would you place those microencapsulates downstream, or would you put them directly in the pancreas?
So actually, typically people would put them in like omental pouches or in the peritoneal cavity and just floating around. It's very dangerous to put almost any particle, but especially a polymer that could cause blood clotting in the bloodstream. So although that would be the fastest response time, people tend not to do that. Another possible location would be subcutaneous, but that's potentially unpleasant to see because you'd need a fairly substantial size. The other thing with these is they're limited in size. As with all tissue engineered constructs, they need an oxygen source. And if they're starved of oxygen, then the cells within them will die. So that's actually one of the big problems in tissue engineering, is that you have to have a blood vessel within about 200 microns of any cell within a construct. So I would say a good chunk right now of the effort that's going into tissue engineering is going into understanding how to vascularize these larger constructs that you're trying to create. So if you're trying to make a big organ, blood supply is incredibly important. Anyway, so that's a side note. Okay, so you can use semi-permeable membranes, you can entrap them in gels. These methods have diffusion limitations. In fact, these methods have diffusion limitations as well, just not as substantial and serious a diffusion limitation. Oh, my wrong sheet. So you can actually, there's a number called the Damphler number. It tells you how big a limitation it is to have your enzyme in these configurations. Whether we'll think about it particularly in the bound method at first. Okay, so that's Vmax over. Sorry. SB. We're gonna get into that. So anyone remember what this little KL is? It's not a reaction rate constant.
It's not Covalent, is it?
Nope. It is from your mass transfer class though.
And is this for bound or entrapped?
Let's think about it first for bound. So we're gonna go through, I mean, it technically is, this part would be different if it was for entrapped. So this is, and we'll talk about why this is the maximum rate of diffusion for bound in a second. Now, I'm gonna do something with that Vmax, and I'm gonna put a little prime on it. And that's an important prime, and I'm gonna explain in a second why we have that important prime. So our maximum rate of reaction divided by our maximum mass transfer diffusion rate. Okay, so if we've got dA much bigger than 1, then what is our limiting component of that? We've got a reaction rate that's super high compared to the diffusion rate. So what ends up being the limiting thing? If you have a really high reaction rate compared to quite a low diffusion rate, what's limiting? Reaction or diffusion? Or one diffusion? Hands up if you think what's limiting is reaction rate. Hands up if you think what's limiting is diffusion rate. 75% of people paying attention. Okay, yes, so that means that's diffusion limited. And of course the opposite is true. So in the cases where your DEM cooler number is much less than 1, then you don't actually really have to worry about your diffusion rate, because your diffusion rate is happening really fast. So what you're going to end up seeing is rates that are very similar to what happens in free solution. Okay, if it's 1, then obviously they're comparable to one another. Okay, so why did I put that prime there? So Vm is max reaction rate in solution. So if you look at the units, it's per mil of solution usually. Okay. Vm prime is max reaction rate on surface. So that should say per meter cubed. So that ends up being per meter squared or per centimeter squared or whatever. But this is if there's a prime, it's saying what the max reaction rate is per unit area. So this one is per volume of solution. This one is per unit area. Now there's another one we're going to come up with in a couple of classes. It'll be a double prime. That's your max reaction rate per one, but now it's not talking about how much reaction rate you get per mil of solution, it's talking about how much reaction rate you get per mil of particle. Does that make sense? So it's just the book kind of slides it in there and mentions it very briefly, but it's quite important to recognize the distinction. And it ends up having pretty serious consequences when you want to do things like calculate what area of bound enzyme sheets you need in order to have a reaction happen in a CSTR. Because you wouldn't be able to calculate that with a VM, you need the VM prime. Okay, so we said there were still some diffusion limitations. If we've got our enzyme bound to a surface, no matter how we've bound it. So there's our backing material, non-porous. It should be familiar from mass transfer. If you've got some substrate concentration, SB, then you've got a diffusional barrier that's sort of like a film, a static film, and through that diffusional barrier, it comes down to some substrate concentration SS. So what the enzymes are busy using up the substrate at the surface, so that's providing the driving force for the substrate out here to diffuse across the static film to get to the surface, right? Make sense? So because it's being used up, you end up with a lower surface. That S is for surface. Sometimes you see, in other textbooks, you'll see an SW for S wall, just so that you're aware. So what we have now is we've got this, the rate of reaction is actually going to be determined by whatever the wall concentration or the surface concentration is of the substrate, not by the concentration of the substrate in the bulk, which is, as you might expect, going to slow down the rate of reaction. So what we do is a balance with the steady state assumption. Okay, so let's see. If we've got SS at the surface and SB in the bulk, anyone, I've already given you a little hint, what's the flux going to be based just on mass transfer issues? So take a look at that to give you a hint of where we're going. So your maximum diffusion rate, your maximum flux from just due to diffusion. Max rate of diffusion. So we're just talking about how fast so KL.
Time unit volume. Wait, what units of KL is it per time per volume?
I think it's per unit area. So
Is it
it's
per second as well?
and yeah.
So you need the time and area or something?
You don't. So no, you're getting more complicated than you need. All you need is the driving force. Now the driving force is the difference between the bulk and the surface. So the reason we said here that the maximum rate of diffusion was KL times SB is that's assuming that SS is 0. So that's the maximum possible rate of diffusion is where SS is 0, right? So now we've got SB minus SS is going to be our flux in due to diffusion. So that's how fast. So KL, what's KL going to be determined by?
Properties of the film, and I guess also the fluid around it.
Yeah, so KL is usually a diffusion coefficient divided by the thickness of the layer. So diffusion coefficient what the fluid is and will depend on what the substrate is. So how fast will one molecule diffuse through a liquid, right? So that's just a property, or it's a function of the properties of what's diffusing and what it's diffusing through. And then the thickness of the layer, what's that determined by? Just generally.
Is that just the distance between that squiggly line to the enzyme?
Yeah,
So
yeah, so. So what would make that layer change in thickness? Thinking about how you might run a reactor.
What is that layer? Is it film? Is it like a?
It's your stagnant film layer,
Oh,
so,
it's not like an actual like
no,
thing, it's just, okay.
yeah, it's so just like in fluids, right? You imagine there's a stagnant film that is attached to the surface, so when you do diffusion checks, it's not, I mean, obviously, you're not gonna have a clean cutoff like that in real life, but they estimate a stagnant film layer that allows you to do a straight and easy calculation, like KL equals SB minus SS, where in truth, it's probably more like that kind of, and they're just estimating that that's the stagnant film size. Makes sense so far, more or less? Does that seem familiar from the mass transfer classes?
So
Conceptually.
the layer thickness relates to like velocity, viscosity, all that fuel stuff.
Absolutely. So the thickness of the layer, basically, you can change it with changing your stirring. Probably the fastest and easiest way of changing it is increasing how fast you're stirring a reactor. So if you want to decrease your thickness, then which would increase your mass transfer or your diffusion rate, your flux due to diffusion, you just stir it more and then you get more mass transfer happening. Same idea in heat transfer, right? More stirring means more transfer. Okay, so we're not going to do anything where we measure diffusion coefficients. We're not going to do anything where we figure out what the thickness of the layer is in this class. You get that in lots of other classes. I'll always tell you what the mass transfer coefficient is for a given situation. But be aware that if you go out in the real world and you're trying to figure out something for your reactor, you may have to figure out what your mass transfer coefficients are for a given situation. End of that little story. Okay. So now we've got what the flux is in to the surface of substrate. But I also told you that it was being used up. And if we're talking steady state, how's it being used up? So it's coming into the surface. It must be being used up at the same rate that it's coming into the surface. What's using it up? Exactly. So this, also JS, will equal what? How do we put that in terms of enzyme reaction rates and substrate concentrations?
K1S. Like you look on, like you put those diagrams, balance diagrams, cycle diagrams we did today. Yeah. Well, S is constant though, isn't it?
So think Michaelis Menten.
Sorry, enzyme concentration is constant.
Enzyme concentration is constant.
S is going to be SS, S sub
Yeah.
S.
Yeah.
And you're also using that.
So think, we're imagining that we don't have any substrate inhibition, we don't have any other inhibitors in there, we're just going straight Michaelis-Menten kinetics. So straight Michaelis-Menten kinetics, our rate is EM, but now it's going to be prime because it's per unit area. And Carl was absolutely right when he said that you have to, the rate is going to depend on the amount of substrate at the surface as opposed to the bulk over KM plus got something actually very similar to what we saw before. Where you had reaction, and now what we've got is something with, so this is, that would be a rate of reaction rate, and this is diffusion, and the slope is, if you look at that, we're looking at the slope versus, here, actually it's going to be SS concentration we're showing down here. The slope is that is going to be minus KL, right? We plot all of that versus S, the slope will be minus KL, versus plotting all of that against S, which gives us that curve like that. So graphically, you can solve that just by looking at it like that. So what happens if you, so say we start mixing it more, so we decrease the thickness of the layer, that increases our KL. So now we've got a steeper, sorry, increases our KL. Yeah, we've got, we end up, what, like this? Is that right? It would get steeper, wouldn't it, if we have increased KL?
Just a negative.
Like that, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, yes, that's absolutely right. So basically, so KL goes up, which means that you're having more diffusion. So the diffusion in is faster, right? So if diffusion in is faster, what that's saying now is you're actually going to get a higher substrate concentration at the surface because it's diffusing in faster, and now the reaction rate isn't keeping up with the diffusion as well. Does that make sense to people generally? Cool. Okay, so now, so that's just sort of the conceptual diagram of what happens. If you wanted to solve it, you have a quadratic, so it's solvable. It's not too bad. But now let's put in one more difficulty into our situation. What happens if we put those got our little enzymes on the surface, and put that into a CSTR? So we've got our flow in, our flow out, our bulk substrate concentration, which is the substrate concentration inside the reactor, S naught, which is how much substrate is going into the reactor. So now we have potentially one more balance, where we also say that that equals that, but it also equals F times S naught minus, S naught minus S bulk over the area of the enzyme surface. So you could conceivably, now we have the tools where we have an enzyme bound to a surface, and if we know that we're putting in a given substrate concentration and need to get out a certain substrate concentration or have a certain conversion to product, which is the same thing, you could calculate what area of bound enzyme you need in the reactor. Or conversely, if you knew that you had this many modules that you could put in with a known surface area, conceptually, you have all the material, all the information you need in order to figure out what our final substrate concentration is coming out.
So that JS is still equal to the other two JS?
It is. It is. So now we've got something where that equals that equals that. So basically we've got 2 equations, and depending on how much information we've got, we end up being able to solve for a couple of unknowns.
What if we had 2 different bulk lines? Like, what if the tank was filling or empty, so the flow rate in is not equal to the flow rate out?
Okay, so we don't have, we will actually address how to deal with that one once we start talking about cells. So that ends up being, you can consider that being sort of a fed batch type situation. We're not gonna worry about anything that's not steady state just yet. But that is something we will eventually have the tools to deal with, so it's a good question. Now, the problems with this, we might wanna say solve for AT, but it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to figure out what our surface substrate concentration is. That's something that's really hard to measure, what the surface substrate concentration is on the enzyme-coated surface. So this ends up being something that we end up needing to solve for in order to solve everything else, but it will rarely be, it just generally won't ever be something that's given to you because you can't measure it. So the question which we'll answer next class is, what are the strategies you can use to go through and solve that if you're given a certain amount of information, not including the surface substrate concentration? How would you design a reactor that works for your situation?